Avalon Hill rebooted RuneQuest with a different editor and with a lot of interaction with the Chaosium and Greg Stafford to really make it a Glorantha game again. So still, it's a very different game in many ways than the earlier versions, but it was a Glorantha game again, and an extensive line of supplements were published. Some of them repurposed old ones, some of them new ones. Sort of the next generation of Glorantha authorship kicked in with names that you would recognize now as, grown-up old dudes of gaming were cutting their teeth here, as well as over in late stage 1990-ish TSR. So that's all happening, but this new, this reissue of RuneQuest by Avalon Hill is, which is very very, very embraced, and for a lot of people, that's their first encounter. So that's kind of the next really huge phase of RuneQuest. I want to emphasize a couple of points. One is that this is not like today, so access to the older versions is so limited, so fortunate, as to simply be absent. You can't rely on it. You either bought those back in the day or you find them in a box somewhere in a game store that someone forgot about, and otherwise you're just not going to see the original works. Another thing to know is that Avalon Hill starts working on a new one. They're going to pull more stuff together. They're going to streamline it more, or make things more coherent, to decide what's going to be in the core book as a presumably canonical material. And there is a sense that this is Chaosium supported. Well, as that turns out, it doesn't work out. Who knows why? But there is a division between Greg Stafford and Avalon Hill. Avalon Hill does not go on to make its RuneQuest. And this is where the terminology gets squirrely. In retrospect, people have been known to refer to that very anticipated redoing of RuneQuest by Avalon Hill as 4th edition, even though there isn't one. But there you go. Weird numbers and factions. Again, some people were extremely invested in it. So you have that. You can criticize me for using this terminology, but Stafford himself becomes something of a faction at this point. You can sort of look at him as the sun source of Glorantha, or you can say, well, there's another voice. And regardless, he puts out a lot of Gloranthan material himself, one of which is a significant book called King of Sartar. And that actually has its own mythological content and philosophical claims and stuff like that. And so it becomes a point of contention in all these debates. So in the mid to late 90s, things are looking real fragmented in some ways, with a lot of intense local commitment to what is Glorantha. Well, different people come in at different places and times. People have different notions of what is sensible or not, who's the bad guy or not, and related matters. Well, when we get to the late 90s, we are also looking at the Chaosium as a company, not cohering. Again, all the details are either of no interest to this conversation, or I don't know them. And the important thing to recognize is that over time, the association with Avalon Hill basically disappears. That a great deal of the different games of the Chaosium are being produced, their supplements are being produced by other companies, and it's kind of hard to tell from the outside, whether the game line is owned by Chaosium. It was, but it's hard to tell. It looks like it's all gone over to different companies. Pendragon's over here and Call of Cthulhu's over there. And it looks like the Chaosium is basically falling apart. And especially because there isn't a publisher for RuneQuest now, really? I mean, it gets real confusing. And suffice to say that by 2000, it looks as if RuneQuest, the Glorantha role-playing game, is effectively not around. And instead, we have a game designed by Robin Laws and published by Stafford himself in a new company, Asaris Incorporated, that is called HeroQuest. And you know what? I just messed up. It's called Hero Wars. They wanted to call it HeroQuest, but that name was not available until just a few years later, and then they nabbed the name when it became available, and so the game became called HeroQuest. So HeroQuest Sensu Lato begins in 2000. It underwent a number of revisions through the thousands. You end up with the noughts. You end up with a series of different, fairly aggressive retoolings of starting setting information and player character options, as well as some system tweaks. There are certain aspects of the system that you sort of keep getting changed up, with each revision. Now, in the meantime, while HeroQuest is undergoing its development, different groups of Glorantha files are meeting, reconciling, splitting, any number of different sort of drama is occurring. It is the noughts and the internet after all. And so to go away from all that, which I fortunately personally avoided greatly, a number of people in Stafford become creatively committed. And so, new people are associated with HeroQuest and with Glorantha in general and are developing material. Before we come to the climax of that moment, let's look at RuneQuest, which has, in fact, rather than disappearing, as it might have appeared around 2000, turns out to sort of do the opposite. It's licensed to a sequence of publishers with a certain through line of people. You can draw circles and arrows for that all you want to. Mongoose Publishing has it for a couple of versions. And there's one, and then there's another. And then a company called the Design Mechanism also gets that license and then makes its own RuneQuest, which is the same authors as the second version from Mongoose. You see what I mean? Things are way too much to footnote here. But the idea is that whole sector shifts into its own RuneQuest. So at the moment we have one by Design Mechanism, which, by the way, is the only one that has a number on the cover for an edition. They call it 6th edition. I suppose if you posit that the Mongoose ones were 5th, I guess. So there's that happening. Things back at the ranch all come to huge reconciliations or agreements or whatever happened. Ultimately, you have a new version of the company called Chaosium Incorporated. And it is primarily staffed by the people who had kind of coalesced around Stafford as a creative bunch. And Sandy Peterson and Stafford are still involved as shareholders. And through a set of, boring shareholding stuff, basically you can consider this the new company, under which we have RuneQuest, Glorantha, and HeroQuest in one spot. So that has led to a couple of things. First of all, the Design Mechanism's version of RuneQuest lapses. They can't use RuneQuest anymore. That game persists as Mithras, with the Glorantha kind of taken out. But it's a very faithful game to earlier RuneQuest in many ways. So that's out there, Mithras. Sometime along the way, in the teens, the Pelgrane Press releases a game called 13th Age, and in due time, coming along in our narrative, it will release 13th Age Glorantha. So now we have Mithras, which is very much a RuneQuest system without Glorantha really officially. And then we have 13th Age, which is a very Glorantha game, but using a very different system. So those are kind of outside the Chaosium. Inside the Chaosium, HeroQuest undergoes its pretty solid, definitive edition with a very, very distinctive, very clear vision of Glorantha, really going back to its earlier roots and being set more in Mesopotamia and Levantine culture analogs, and extremely into, the mythic power of the setting. So that's going on with HeroQuest, and that has been produced not too long followed, quite recently, but not too long after, followed finally by a RuneQuest produced by Chaosium for really, in-house for the first time since, 1980. So that is, the effect that we have now. We do have a new RuneQuest. We do have a new HeroQuest, new-ish. We have 13th Age Glorantha. We've got Mithras. Now, what else do we have? Is that all? And is it just a little ladder of editions? The answer is no, it is not a little ladder of editions. All sorts of other Gloranthas proliferated and created nodes of play and social commitment throughout this entire history. You can go and find developed documents which add up to a considerable amount of role-playing text, as good as well role-played, play-tested as socially committed to as anything that was published as a book. So there's who knows how many, 20? But you can find them, and you can find the communities that are dedicated to them. For your purposes, listener, you're probably going to sit down at somebody's table, and they're probably going to already have what they're going to use. They pull it out, plop, put it down on the table. Who knows? Maybe it's the second version, or maybe it's the design mechanisms one, or maybe it's like me, and you see some dog-eared, beaten up old things that look like they were made by hippies in a coffee shop, because they kind of were. And so that's what you're going to be playing. And you might as well get used to the fact that, it's not the newest and latest and greatest, because the editions didn't replace one another within a publisher as a linear trajectory. There's a spray in all these directions, including the ones that are printed and published and the ones that aren't. They're all just endpoints in this multi-directional spray. So that's the bit about publishing and the history, why you might be running into sort of ideological hassles with people or seeing them among people.